Well, welcome to Midweek, this Experiments in Faithfulness. This is a weekly facilitated spiritual practice where we learn and grow with each other right here in community. And if ever there were a time for community, it would be now. My name is Brent, and I am the Program and Engagement Manager here at Beacon Hill Friends House. We are a Quaker Center and home to Beacon Hill Friends Meeting. And we're also a residential community of about 20-ish people or so. We are delighted to host this midweek program every week. Tonight we have Wendy Cooler presenting Coming Together for Continuing Revelation. So Coming Together for Continuing Revelation will introduce and practice some of the skills of discernment, even when things are really hard, but in a protected environment. Our discernment practice starts with a query that isn't as challenging as those we face at home, but with the explicit knowledge of what some of those queries might be. Now I'm excited to introduce you to Wendy Cooler, a public minister under the care of Sandy Spring Monthly Meeting. Her essays, lectures, and workshops on trauma, interpersonal violence, and crisis have been sponsored by Quaker institutions. She also serves one-on-one as a discernment facilitator and trauma educator with communities in crisis. So, Wendy, it is all yours, my friend.
Thank you, Brent. Brent and I know each other from several years back because I was a student at Earlham School of Religion when he was the director of student and alumni engagement. And he started that job after I got there. He was a pretty new employee at the time of the story I'm going to tell you. I think he'd only been there a few months. Um, I have a learning disability. Um, and the way it affects me is I have trouble knowing where I am in space or time. Um, like the divine, maybe, I guess that's a positive way of looking at it. But I also just have trouble with forms. Forms don't look like whatever forms look like to neurotypical people to me. Lines kind of go together. I get lost. Um, and I was a distance student at Earlham School of Religion, and I had enormous difficulty with Moodle, which is the service that they were using at the time to kind of like online classes had these like Moodle forums, which were like message boards, and there would be an assignment posted, but it wasn't just an assignment like read this, write about this. It was like discuss amongst yourselves on Moodle. And it was just, it was completely inaccessible to me. I just could not access Moodle. Um, and I was really ashamed of this. And so I wasn't really being very clear with my professors that Moodle was completely inaccessible to me. I was doing very well in my in-person classes. They have these things called intensives, and they happen 3 times a year, and you go to campus for 2 weeks. And I would go to every single intensive, and I was trying to take as many credits as possible in my intensives. And the difference in me as a student was just like black and white. I was doing very well in my intensives and very, very poorly in my classes on Moodle. And Brent and I were trying to recall the exact thing, but I was either failing or I had withdrawn from 2 classes that were on Moodle. And it doesn't matter. So the policy at ESR used to be that it didn't matter how far apart those failures or withdrawals were, you'd get put on academic probation, but then your financial aid would be taken away from you. And I couldn't continue on without financial aid. And I didn't expect Brent to help me at all. And Brent just took it upon himself. He noticed this was happening. He called me in. He asked me to explain how this could be. Um, and he went to the faculty and he asked them, do you think this is justice? Do you think this is good for the Religious Society of Friends that Wendy Cooler can't continue in her degree program as a result of our policy? And they said no. They didn't think it was justice and they didn't think it was good for Quakers. And they changed their policy. And they changed their policy because Brent asked them to. And I feel like, I don't know how much work it was, but I feel like it was probably a lot of work. And it was a really brave thing to do in your first couple of months of employment, Brent. And I'm telling this story actually because it's relevant to what we're talking about tonight. It's not just a nice story about Brent um, um, and a story about me having a learning disability. Um, it's a story about continuing revelation, which is what we are here to talk about tonight. It's a story about seeing that a decision we have made in the past is maybe not the right decision and isn't fitting the environment that we currently live in. And it's about having the courage to behave in a way that promotes justice, like Brent did in that story, as a relatively new employee to stick up for this woman he doesn't even know. Um, because, not because he liked me, but because he felt like it was the right thing to do. Um, so I offer the discernment model that we're going to talk about this evening as a 6-week course at Woodbrook Online. Which should tell you we can't get too deeply into into what it is this evening. It's not something that we master immediately. It's like the game Othello. Minutes to learn and a lifetime to master or something. Um, it's a relatively straightforward process, but it's very labor intensive and requires a lot of inner work to be a good facilitator. Um, so I thank goodness Brent, allowed me to stay at ESR because this was created at ESR as a part of my supervised ministry. When you get a Master of Divinity, I think at any school, you're required to do a year of supervision. In the field. And I was supervised by a Quaker pastor named Margaret Webb. I don't know if anyone here knows her. She's terrific. She was at New Garden Friends at the time. Um, and she worked with me to create a response to what I was seeing in the Quaker world, which was a lot of reactivity, a lot of not conflict aversion, but repair aversion, a lot of sort of unrealized love. Um, the love that we actually feel for each other was not sort of reaching each other. We do some really messed up things to each other inside of our communities. And I wanted some way of talking about these things. And when I looked around at like the public ministry world, the only model I could see was, writing really clever articles that, take people down. Pointing out problems by setting the world on fire. And sometimes I felt like doing that, but I think and the story I just told you about Brent and a thousand other stories. Over my years in seminary, I really underwent a lot of spiritual maturation and began to see that that's just not the way to do conflict. It's not the way to convey a cry for justice, is the pointed essay. Um, and so instead of telling people sort of walking, instead of walking on the earth, telling everyone what I thought about everything all the time, and demanding a response to, my cries for justice, I wanted to build on clearness committees, specifically. And what can really be done in a competent clearness committee. But one of the problems with clearness committees, um, is that they are about individual clearness, not community clearness. Um, and so I wanted something that would honor the individual and help those with a cry for justice truly be heard, not just feel heard. And I also wanted to move that cry for justice forward into the community itself, where everyone could be heard and everyone could experience what it was to be heard. And at the end, maybe not have a solution, but have some guidance for how to make decisions about this sticky problem in the future. And I've been using this process ever since 2021, I think, successfully, in communities. What communities often discover is that what they think the problem is not what the problem is. The problem is probably several layers under whatever is presenting itself. And this felt, I didn't know this ahead of time, but this feels tonight very appropriate to where we are as a country. Um, I'll opine a little bit. Um, and I read the results of this election and where our country is, if you're an American, um, as being about problems that are maybe 5 layers under the surface. Um, and, what we think is wrong is just not wrong. I don't know what is wrong, but we need to find out how to see this with each other so that we can address these things. And I think there's no better place to start than in our own families and in our own Quaker communities. Um, so we don't have a lot of time this evening, and therefore I can't do a lot of presentation. But I want to talk to you about, what do I want to talk to you about? Okay. I want to talk to you in the time we have before I put you in breakout groups and allow you to practice one of the skills that is a part of this process about what continuing revelation even is. Um, so continuing revelation, I am teaching this at Woodbrook, and someone wrote back when I named this process recently. I was just calling it the process for the longest time. I couldn't name this thing for years. I was going to name it, gathering together for continuing revelation, and someone said, "Oh, is that biblical?" Um, and yes and no, but I'm actually referring to the Quaker idea of continuing revelation, which is a foundation of our theology. And my understanding of Quaker theology, anyway, is that God is alive inside of me, and God is alive inside of you, and God is alive inside of Brent, and God is alive inside of Patty and Judy. God is alive inside of each of us. And that there's like a logical consequence to that idea that God is alive in each of us. And that is that God needs to speak to God's own self because God is scattered amongst us. And that is what we are doing in waiting worship, in my interpretation of Quaker theology, is we are facilitating God's conversation with God's own self. And that God is making and remaking the world every day through our relationships with each other. And therefore, our relationships are holy. And continuing revelation, then, in this interpretation of our theology, is that constant making and remaking of the world through our relationships. And I want to talk to you about secular psychology, which is the thing that is married to continuing revelation in this model of discernment. Specifically, the work of a psychiatrist named Judith Herman. She is a Harvard psychiatrist in her early 80s. Um, she is a provocative thinker. She is, one of the foundational thinkers of modern trauma theory, and she's also different than other trauma theorists. She writes a book every 10 years and drops the mic and, goes off again to think brilliant things. But one of her contributions that I most appreciate is this idea that trauma, which is she defines as the separation from yourself and your community, and I would say as a Quaker from God, that it's profound existential isolation. That trauma is not a psychiatric issue, which is provocative coming from a Harvard psychiatrist. She believes that trauma, this isolation, is actually a justice issue and requires justice-focused solutions and community solutions because the goal of trauma response would be to bring someone back into the community, to bring someone back to God, to bring someone back into relationship with themselves if trauma is isolating those things. And she has this three-part process that, again, is very simple on the surface, but it begins with creating physical and psychological safety for the traumatized person. It would take much longer than we have to talk about what that might mean, but I would invite you to think about that. And it also secondarily involves memory, encouraging and creating spaces to engage our memory of the trauma. Um, and then thirdly is reintegration into the community. And most recently, last year, and Judy actually wrote a piece about this for Sierra Cascades. If you want to look up the Sierra Cascades newsletter and read more about this. She recently started talking about healing justice. And that is when remarkable survivors become the leaders inside their communities and facilitate healing justice for everyone else inside the community. So this model that I sent you notes about, which begins with the individual and progressively moves towards creating queries with the entire community, is based on this theological idea of continuing revelation, but also Judith Herman's work on trauma. Um, and I would say that whenever we're in a crisis, we are in some state of trauma. And often conflict creates trauma, not necessarily, but it can because of the poor way in which we deal with it. Um, and so I'd like to I wish I could, just tell you what I think, but we don't have time for that. So I will invite you to think about how Judith Herman's model of trauma healing and a healing justice is being wedded to this theological idea of continuing revelation as we move forward in this work together and see if that works for you. Um, so Brett and I wanted to invite you to spend as much time as possible in the one-on-one listening. It will actually be in groups of 3, so not quite one-on-one. And so that each person can have a turn as a listener Each person can have a turn as a speaker, and each person can have a turn as an observer in the space. So this is always, in a much more extended form, the first step of this discernment process. The facilitator will invite individual members of the community to come to them one-on-one, and they will have their notebook. I order these in bulk, um, and several writing implements in case one of them breaks. And they will explain to them the following. They will say, "My role today is to listen to you. I will not ask questions. I will not make conversation with you. Please don't ask me questions because I can't answer you in this space. We are going to go into waiting worship together. Please stay with me for a full hour." In this case, it's 7 minutes. But please stay with me for a full hour. If you need to speak for more than an hour, I can probably do 90 minutes, but after that, I start to be fatigued. And we can schedule another time for you to finish speaking your truth. I'm going to ask you a query from the silence. You can respond to it in whatever way you're called. Maybe you think the query is not about the crisis that I have been called into. Maybe you want to speak about something else. Anything you want to say in this space is confidential and it is welcome. You'll ask them if they have any questions. They often have some anxiety about what's going to happen, and so there'll be some back and forth while you again reiterate some boundaries about what this space is, because this is not a conversational space. This is the space where you will listen to them and, as closely as you can, write down in your notebook verbatim notes of what they have said to you. At the end of your time together, you will ask permission to read the notes back, and you'll tell them before you do that, please stop me in the moment and correct the notes. You can correct them in whatever way you want. Maybe I got something wrong. I write fast, I make mistakes. Maybe you actually said something, and when you hear it read back to you, you realize you don't really feel that way. And you can correct the notes then. This is not a qualitative research project. Right now, what we are doing is one-on-one pastoral care with someone, where you are creating the space where they can be in conversation with the divine through you. You're reflecting back to them the divinity in what they just said. So this evening, this is unlikely to happen, but I will invite you to get the email addresses of the people that are in your group, because in the full process, what happens is the note taker types the notes. They don't type them at the time that the person is speaking, and I feel like this is really important out of experience for maintaining the relational quality of this. But the corrected notes are typed and then sent back to the focus person within a couple of days of their having met with you. And it's very important that those notes are confidential to them. And we can talk more at the end of our time together about how these confidential notes get transformed into something that the community then labors with. But at this point, the notes are confidential. You will not even tell anyone when doing this work who you have spoken with inside of the community. So I'm going to ask you if you have any questions. I did take 5 minutes longer than I was supposed to. and I'd like for you to have 21 minutes in your group, which gives each of you 7 minutes to do this. But do you have any questions about what you're about to do?
I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording here so that questions can be confidential as well.
Okay.